Welcome on board, chosen one. Let's not pretend this came out of nowhere. You felt it months ago. The silence changed. The reactions shifted. The people who used to talk loud about you suddenly went quiet, or worse, started whispering. Funny how that works. When they said you were finished, when they laughed and told others, "Watch, they'll fold," when they acted like your story already ended. Look who's watching now. Look who suddenly needs a conversation. Oh, the legend needs to bow, right? That's what they said. And yet here we are. Here's the cold fact they don't want you to sit with too long. Nobody monitors someone they've already beaten. Nobody studies a nobody for 6 straight months. People don't gather data, track patterns, and quietly exchange notes about someone who isn't becoming a problem. They only do that when something doesn't make sense, when someone refuses to break on schedule, when someone keeps standing after the moment they were supposed to disappear. They've been watching how you move in silence, how you stopped explaining yourself, how you didn't beg for validation when the door closed. They noticed you didn't react the way they predicted. No public meltdown, no dramatic collapse, just distance, just discipline, just that unnerving calm that makes insecure people panic. You didn't announce your growth, you didn't brag, you didn't even defend yourself, and that's what scared them. Because here's the part nobody warned them about. When someone survives being underestimated long enough, they stop being visible in the usual ways. They become unreadable, and unreadable people terrify systems built on control. You're standing in the quiet after the storm now, that strange phase where the noise is gone, but the tension is thick. The enemy smiles in public, but checks over their shoulder in private. They replay old conversations, old decisions, old jokes they made at your expense. Suddenly those jokes don't land anymore. Suddenly your name carries weight, not because you demanded it, but because the universe started responding differently to you. And yes, right here in the middle of this moment, tap the like button and subscribe. Not as a favor to me, but as a way to pay this message forward. This isn't content, it's a signal. If you're part of this, make it known. Now let's go back to what they won't admit out loud. The sit-down request isn't respect, it's containment. It's them trying to get a read on you again, to see if the old version is still accessible, to test whether you're still emotional, still reactive, still easy to steer with a compliment or a fake apology. They don't want peace, they want leverage. Think about it. If you were harmless, they wouldn't need the meeting. If you were still lost, they wouldn't care where you're headed. This isn't reconciliation. This is reconnaissance. And the pain point for you, it's realizing how long you were underestimated on purpose, how often they smiled while quietly doubting you, how many rooms you were discussed in without being invited. That hurts. It cuts deep. Because you didn't just survive struggle, you survived being misjudged by people who watched you closely and still chose to bet against you. But here's the twist they didn't plan for. You used that time. While they observed, you adapted. While they tracked, you refined. While they waited for cracks, you built structure. This is why the energy feels different now. This is why the world responds differently. You're no longer chasing outcomes. Outcomes are circling you. There's an old pattern the universe repeats, and you've stepped into it without realizing. The most dangerous people are never the loudest ones. They're the ones who learned restraint early, the ones who learned to think while others panicked, the ones who got hurt, learned the rules of the game, then stopped playing it the same way. That's you now. Not because you're angry, but because you're clear. They remember the version of you that needed approval. That's the mistake. They think this sit-down is a reset. It's not. It's a reveal. You're about to see who's nervous, who over-explains, who suddenly wants to clear the air. Watch closely. Power exposes itself when it's threatened. This isn't about revenge, it's about position. You're no longer reacting to the board. You're reading it. You're no longer asking why things happened. You're understanding how they work. And once that clicks, something irreversible happens. You stop needing permission. That's why this feels emotional, because you're mourning the version of you that didn't know and stepping into the version that does. They monitored you for 6 months, and now they're requesting a sit-down, not because you lost, but because you won quietly. And the scariest part for them, you're not even done yet. Now pause right here. This is the moment where weak attention drops off and the real ones lean in. If you're still listening, it's because something in this hit too close to ignore. You felt that quiet pressure in your chest, the same one you've been carrying for months while they were watching, measuring, pretending not to notice you leveling up. This isn't random. People who aren't involved don't stay this long. Only the ones who've lived it recognize the signal. So listen carefully, chosen one. What comes next isn't hype, and it's not comfort. It's a breakdown, step by step, clean, sharp. The kind of truth they never warned you about because it turns observation into power. If they really spent 6 months monitoring you, then what you're about to hear explains why they're suddenly asking for a sit-down instead of laughing from a distance. Before we move forward, lock yourself into this moment. Drop a comment with 777 if you're ready to understand what they saw, what changed, and why the balance quietly shifted in your favor. Not for algorithms, for alignment, for commitment, for signaling that you're not just watching, you're present. And don't rush away. If you're truly who this message is meant for, you'll feel the pull to stay until the end. The universe doesn't waste revelations on people who quit halfway. Now, let's dive into it, step by step. Number 1, they watched you too long, and that's where they messed up. The moment you start watching someone this closely, you've already admitted you're afraid of what they might become. That's the part they'll never say out loud. They told themselves surveillance was power, that watching you gave them control, that collecting data, tracking habits and logging patterns would keep them ahead of you. In their minds, you weren't a person anymore. You were a variable, a case file, a problem to be managed before it grew teeth. So they invested time, money, attention, systems designed to catch every deviation. People whose entire job was to wake up thinking about you and go to sleep confused by you. That's not exaggeration. That's reality. You became the assignment, the thing that didn't behave right, the one who refused to follow the expected arc. Here's the gut punch they didn't see coming. Surveillance only works on people who move unconsciously, on people who live on impulse, on people who don't think ahead. The moment awareness enters the picture, surveillance flips. The watcher becomes exposed, the observed becomes dangerous. And yes, you knew. You knew because the air changed, conversations shifted, reactions slowed, questions became oddly specific. People started fishing instead of speaking directly. You felt that strange tension where nothing was said, but everything was implied. That's when you realized this wasn't curiosity anymore. This was monitoring. So let's answer the questions sitting in your chest right now. Did you imagine it? No. Was it paranoia? No. People don't accidentally watch someone for 6 months. They don't assign teams. They don't escalate language. They don't flag behavior as intentional unless something about you stopped making sense to them. That's when the report started sounding different. Not confident, not cocky, careful. Words like aware, words like calculated, words like proceed with caution. That's bureaucratic language for fear. That's what systems say when control starts slipping, but nobody wants to admit it. They thought surveillance would corner you. What it actually did was force you into clarity. While they watched, you simplified. While they tracked, you slowed down. While they waited for you to crack, you learned restraint. That's not weakness, that's strategy. That's the kind of discipline that only forms when someone realizes they're being tested and decides not to flinch. Here's a truth that hits hard if you really sit with it. They weren't watching you to understand you. They were watching you to confirm a weakness. And when none showed up, that's when surveillance became a liability. Because now every move you made had intention behind it. Every silence meant something. Every delay created uncertainty. You weren't reacting anymore. You were choosing, and nothing unsettles a controlling mind faster than a person who stops being predictable. Think of it like this. A spotlight only works if the person under it panics. You didn't. You stood there calmly. You let them stare. You let them squint. You let them second guess. Eventually, the spotlight stops being blinding and starts exposing the one holding it. That's what happened here. They expected emotion. You gave them composure. They expected collapse. You gave them consistency. They expected noise. You gave them nothing. And silence is terrifying to people who rely on reaction to feel powerful. So when you ask yourself, why now? This is why. 6 months of watching didn't give them answers. It gave them more questions. 6 months of data didn't reduce risk. It increased it. Because the longer they watched, the clearer it became that you were not spiraling, you were stabilizing, and that's unacceptable to anyone who needs you small. There's another uncomfortable truth you deserve to hear. Surveillance changes the watcher. They start projecting. They start filling gaps with fear. They start assuming intent where there's simply control. Every neutral action becomes suspicious. Every success becomes a threat. Every calm response feels calculated. That's why the sit-down request appears. It's not confidence, it's damage control. They want to see your eyes, hear your tone, feel your presence. Because the version of you they built in their heads is starting to look dangerous, and they need reassurance that you're still manageable, still human, still accessible. But here's the villain wisdom they never planned for. You don't owe clarity to people who chose observation over respect. You don't owe comfort to systems that watched instead of supported. And you definitely don't owe explanations to anyone who only started paying attention once you became impossible to ignore. You didn't weaponize awareness. You mastered it. That's the difference. And if a part of you is wondering whether you should feel guilty about that, let me be clear. Awareness isn't aggression. Control isn't cruelty. Restraint isn't weakness. It's evolution. It's what happens when someone survives long enough to understand the rules and decides to stop playing naive. They tried to stay 3 steps ahead. What they didn't realize is that you stepped out of the race entirely. You let them chase shadows while you built something solid. You let them log behaviors while you rewired yourself. You let them watch while you learned when not to move. That's why this phase feels heavy. Because you're no longer becoming, you're being recognized. And recognition always comes with resistance. So if you're asking yourself what this moment means, here's the answer they can't handle. Surveillance didn't weaken you, it trained you, it forced precision, it sharpened self-control, it burned away impulsiveness and left something colder, calmer, and far more effective. They thought watching you would protect them. Instead, it revealed you. And once someone sees you clearly, there's no going back to pretending you're harmless. Number 2, they slipped first and told on themselves. When people try to spy without confidence, they don't gather information. They leak intention. This is where it got embarrassing for them. Not dangerous, not impressive, just sloppy. Because after months of watching from a distance, curiosity started eating at them. Data wasn't enough anymore. Spreadsheets don't show tone. Logs don't explain intuition. Numbers don't tell you why someone feels different when they walk into a room. So they did what insecure systems always do when patience runs out. They moved closer. And the moment they did, they exposed themselves. It started small, too small to accuse, but too loud to ignore. A random question that went one layer too deep. Someone suddenly interested in details they had no reason to care about. A message that felt oddly timed, like it was sent to test a reaction rather than start a conversation. These weren't accidents. They were probes. Here's the part they underestimated. You didn't just notice the behavior. You noticed the energy behind it. You felt the tension underneath the friendliness, the stiffness behind the smiles, the way certain people were listening too closely, reacting too slowly, or nodding a second late, like they were processing more than they were admitting. You've been lied to enough to recognize performance. Real curiosity feels light. Surveillance feels heavy. They tried to disguise monitoring as coincidence. That was mistake number 1. Coincidences don't stack. Patterns don't accidentally form around the same person. When timing becomes too perfect, it stops feeling lucky and starts feeling staged. You saw that. You felt that. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. Imagine this. You're walking through a room you've been in 100 times. Suddenly, the furniture is rearranged just slightly. Not enough to trip you, but enough to make you slow down. That's what their moves felt like. Subtle disruptions designed to test awareness. They wanted to see if you'd react, flinch, adjust publicly, give them confirmation. You didn't, and that's when the discomfort kicked in for them. The scariest thing to someone fishing for reactions is a person who refuses to bite. They expected confusion. You gave them neutrality. They expected curiosity. You gave them distance. They expected gratitude for attention. You gave them nothing, no questions back, no emotional hooks, no tells. That silence wasn't empty. It was loaded. Let's answer the question you're probably asking yourself right now. Why did they get clumsy? Because subtlety requires calm, and calm disappears when control starts slipping. The moment they realized you weren't behaving like a monitored subject, anxiety crept in, and anxious people rush. So the masks started slipping. The same questions came from different mouths, the same topics circled back too often. Digital traces showed up where none should exist. Likes, views, accidental follows, unexplained appearances. They told themselves they were being clever. In reality, they were getting careless. Imagine a hunter who starts breaking branches because the silence is getting to them. That's what happened here. The quiet you maintained became unbearable. They needed confirmation you were still reachable, still human, still reactive. And every move they made to check that pushed them further into exposure. Control hates ambiguity. That's why it always overreaches. You noticed the rehearsed conversations, the way certain interactions felt scripted, like someone was following a checklist instead of speaking naturally. You noticed how praise felt misplaced, criticism felt delayed, and concern felt performative. These weren't genuine exchanges. They were tests disguised as social moments. And here's where your power quietly showed up. You didn't confront them, you didn't accuse, you didn't even acknowledge it openly, because confrontation would have fed the narrative. accusation would have revealed emotion. Instead, you adjusted internally. You listened more than you spoke. You responded without revealing. You stayed polite without being accessible. You let them reveal themselves through repetition. That's advanced awareness. That's not paranoia. That's pattern recognition. Once someone starts trying to manage you, every move they make tells you more about them than about yourself. Think about how wild this is. They set out to gather intelligence on you. Instead, they handed you a map of their fear, their urgency, their lack of patience, their inability to sit with uncertainty. Every clumsy move answered a question you didn't even have to ask. Why are they nervous now? Because they moved too early. Why are they requesting a sit-down? Because subtlety failed. Why does the tone feel different? Because the power dynamic shifted quietly the moment you didn't react. Imagine a chess player knocking over a piece while pretending it was part of the plan. That's the energy here. They made the first obvious mistake. And in strategic environments, the first mistake changes everything. If you're wondering whether you should have stopped them earlier, hear this clearly. Letting someone reveal themselves is often more powerful than exposing them. You didn't lose time. You gained leverage. You learned who talks too much, who can't hold a mask, who panics when things don't go their way. And the universe notices restraint. They wanted to provoke you into self-exposure. Instead, they exposed their hand. They wanted you to feel watched and shrink. Instead, you grew quieter, sharper, more contained. That's when surveillance stops feeling safe and starts feeling dangerous to the watcher. Because now they don't know what you know. The moment someone realizes they've shown too much, every move after that feels desperate. That's why the energy shifted again. Less probing, more politeness, less testing, more invitation. The sit-down request doesn't come from strength. It comes from the realization that the informal methods failed, that you're not as readable as they assumed. And here's the motivation buried inside this for you. You didn't need to overpower them. You didn't need to out-talk them. You didn't need to prove intelligence. All you did was stay centered, and that alone unraveled their strategy. So if you ever doubted whether your awareness mattered, let this settle in. The first cracks didn't come from you pushing back. They came from them pushing forward too soon. And once someone shows you they can't stay disciplined under uncertainty, you already know who wins in the long run. They tried to be subtle, they failed, and from that moment on, the game stopped being even. Number 3, you didn't flinch. You took the stage and ran the room. Running is what prey does. You stayed, adjusted the lighting, and let them watch the wrong show. This is where the story turns uncomfortable for them, because when the pressure increased, when the watching became obvious, when most people would have panicked or disappeared, you didn't do either. You leaned in, calm, measured, almost cooperative, and that confused the hell out of them. They expected avoidance. You gave them presence. They expected disruption. You gave them consistency. They expected fear. You gave them control. But here's the part they still don't understand. What you showed them was a performance, not the truth. You let them observe habits that meant nothing. You repeated patterns that were safe to copy. You spoke just enough to satisfy curiosity while guarding the core. Everything important stayed locked behind your eyes. That wasn't luck. That was training. You weren't raised in environments where people told you the truth plainly. You grew up learning tone before words. You learned intention before promises. You learned how to read rooms because not reading them came with consequences. This wasn't talent. It was survival sharpened over time. Some people learn awareness from books. Others learn it because missing a signal once was too expensive. So when the watchers leaned closer, you didn't stiffen. You adjusted. You gave them something to write down without giving them anything to use. That's a dangerous skill, because the moment you can control what others think they see, you stop being reactive. Imagine this. A magician doesn't hide his hands. He controls where you look. That's what you did. You let them focus on movement while the real mechanics stayed untouched. They walked away thinking they understood you, not realizing they'd been guided. If you're wondering whether that makes you manipulative, here's the truth. You didn't start the observation. You adapted to it. There's a difference. Awareness isn't deception. It's defense refined. They were watching for cracks. Instead, they saw composure. And the scariest part for them is this. Someone who can perform under surveillance isn't fragile. They're disciplined, they're dangerous, and they don't need to run anymore. You leaned in, and from that moment on, they were no longer watching you. They were studying their mistake. Number 4. You let them watch and quietly rewrote the rules. The game ends the moment the target realizes they can design the trap. You felt it instantly, not as fear, not as panic, but as awareness, like the air shifting before a storm breaks. Something changed in how people moved around you, how questions landed, how silence stretched. That was the moment everything split into before and after, and instead of reacting like they expected, you made a decision that rewired the entire situation. You didn't resist the surveillance, you welcomed it. That's the part they'll never recover from. You let them watch, but on your terms. You fed them information that looked valuable but meant nothing. You repeated behaviors that created patterns without revealing motive. You didn't lie, you curated, and that's far more dangerous, because lies can be caught. Controlled truth shapes conclusions. The smartest move isn't hiding, it's deciding what the enemy is allowed to understand. They believed data equals power. You understood something deeper. Narrative beats numbers every time. So you became the author of your own file. You knew what they'd highlight. You knew what they'd misread. You knew exactly which details would distract them from the real center of gravity. Imagine this, a stage actor performing under a spotlight. The audience thinks they're seeing everything, but the real mechanics happen backstage. That's what you did. You stepped under the microscope willingly, steady and composed, smiled up at the lens, and gave them a show polished enough to earn their confidence. Confidence is how observers get lazy. When someone thinks they've figured you out, they stop questioning their blind spots. That's when the game flipped. Not loudly, not dramatically, internally. You stopped being a subject and became the operator. They thought they were tracking progress. You were guiding interpretation. They thought they were ahead. You had already moved on. If you're wondering whether this was risky, here's the truth. Running would have confirmed weakness. Hiding would have raised suspicion. Staying visible while remaining unreadable was the only move that collapsed their advantage. Checkmate didn't happen at the end. It happened the moment you chose control over fear, and they're only just realizing it now. Number 5. You gave them a puzzle with no picture on the box. Nothing wastes an enemy's time like data that feels important and means absolutely nothing. They asked for patterns, so you handed them patterns. Clean ones, repeating ones, the kind analysts love because they look intelligent on paper. Daily rhythms, predictable windows, emotional responses that showed up right on schedule. To them, it felt like progress. To you, it was misdirection with a straight face. They wanted to understand how you think, so you let them think they were close. You showed emotion, but only the surface kind. Timed reactions, controlled pauses, carefully placed intensity that looked real but carried no leverage. You weren't pretending randomly, you were performing on cue. If someone insists on watching you, the least you can do is make the show useless. They were hunting predictability, so you planted false tells, small habits that suggested direction, tiny behaviors that hinted at intent, breadcrumbs that looked meaningful enough to follow, and they followed every single one. Meetings discussed, notes taken, conclusions drawn, all of it built on foundations that led nowhere. Imagine a maze where every turn feels deliberate, but none of them reach the center. That's what you gave them. Movement without destination, activity without truth. They stayed busy, you stayed free. Patterns don't equal truth, they equal comfort for people afraid of uncertainty. While they obsessed over what you allowed them to see, the real work happened off camera, quiet, untagged, untracked. You were building in places their tools couldn't reach, planning in ways their models couldn't process, becoming something that doesn't show up on dashboards or reports. If you're wondering whether this was dishonest, understand this: they weren't owed access. They chose observation instead of trust. You simply adapted. Surveillance only works if the subject believes visibility equals vulnerability. You broke that assumption, and now they're sitting on months of beautifully organized nonsense, trying to reconcile why their conclusions don't match reality. That's the danger of confusing patterns with understanding. They thought they were decoding you. What they really did was study a decoy while the real version of you walked right past them. Number 6. They confused eyes with power, and that's where they lost. Seeing someone move is not the same as knowing where they're going. This was the fatal mistake, the one they never corrected because it felt too logical to question. They believed that watching you meant understanding you, that tracking behavior automatically translated into control. That observation itself was leverage. It wasn't. It was exposure. They forgot one inconvenient truth: surveillance is never one-sided. The moment someone watches you long enough, they start revealing themselves, their habits, their priorities, their fears, their limits. And while they were busy logging your movements, you were quietly studying theirs. The watcher always leaves fingerprints. Every method they used told you something. What they focused on showed you what they feared. What they ignored showed you their blind spots. What they escalated revealed their pressure points. You weren't guessing, you were learning. Every monitor turned into an intelligence feed. Every report you sensed being written taught you how their minds work. Imagine a guard pacing the same route every night, convinced the cameras make him invisible. That's them. Repeating systems, recycled thinking, predictable escalation. They mistook routine for security. You noticed patterns in their watching. When they leaned in, when they pulled back, when interest spiked, when anxiety crept in. You learned what made them nervous without them saying a word. Control fails the moment the observed stops being naive. They thought data flowed one direction. They never considered that your awareness was sharpening faster than their tools. While they were busy trying to define you, you were defining the limits of their system. Here's the question you might be asking yourself now. Did they ever really have the advantage? No. They had volume, not insight. Access, not understanding. Observation without interpretation is just noise. Surveillance without self-awareness is just a mirror pointed the wrong way. By the time they realized this, it was too late. You already knew how they think, what they miss, how slow they adapt. And once you understand the watcher, fear disappears. They assumed eyes meant power. You learned minds matter more, and that realization quietly ended the game. Number 7. That's when confidence died. Quietly in the reports. Nothing scares a system more than realizing it no longer knows what's real. This is where the tone changed behind closed doors. You didn't hear it directly, but you felt it. The certainty drained out of the air. Reports that once sounded sharp and decisive started wobbling. Strong conclusions softened into questions. Clear labels turned into guesses. The language shifted from "this is who they are" to "we think and it's possible." That's not analysis. That's doubt bleeding through professionalism. They started asking for backup, not because the workload increased, but because confidence collapsed. When monitors request second opinions, it means trust in the data is gone. When supervisors start asking uncomfortable questions, it means someone above them smells failure, and failure in surveillance isn't loud, it's silent panic. The most dangerous moment for an observer is when their notes stop agreeing with reality. They're sitting on months of logs now, pages of behavior, charts, timelines, conclusions stacked neatly on top of each other, and none of it explains the present version of you. The data says one thing, the outcome says another. That gap is terrifying to people who believe control comes from documentation. Imagine spending half a year mapping a maze, only to realize the walls were moving the whole time. That's what this feels like for them. They're rereading old entries, looking for missed signals, trying to figure out when the shift happened. Was it always like this? Did they miss the moment you took control? Or worse, did you let them miss it? Uncertainty doesn't scare people. Realizing they've been confident for the wrong reasons does. Here's the question they can't answer and won't say out loud. How much of what they observed was real, and how much was a performance designed for them? That thought eats at credibility, because if they can't tell the difference, then their entire operation is compromised. And that's the truth. They don't know anymore. The universe doesn't reward watchers who confuse visibility with access. You stayed visible, you stayed calm, and now their own records are working against them. Because nothing is more dangerous than realizing too late that the person you thought you understood was always one step ahead. Number 8. The second they admitted they'd lost you. Fear doesn't arrive with noise. It arrives the moment certainty collapses. There was a moment, small, quiet, easy to miss if you weren't inside the operation. That's when fear walked in and locked the door behind it. Not panic, not chaos, something worse. Admission. Maybe it was when you glanced toward a lens that wasn't supposed to exist and smiled. Not a nervous smile. Not defiance, recognition. The kind that says, "I see you seeing me." That alone is enough to rattle people who rely on invisibility to feel powerful. Or maybe it was the wild chase. 3 months of effort poured into a direction you designed. Meetings held, assumptions reinforced, resources spent, and then nothing. No outcome, no payoff, just a trail that ended in thin air. Nothing shakes confidence like effort without results. But for some of them, it was simpler, colder, One room, one voice, the best analyst, the one everyone trusts, the one whose judgment carries weight, looking at 6 months of work and finally saying the sentence nobody wants on record. I don't know what we're looking at. Every pattern shifts. That's not confusion, that's collapse. Imagine building a map that keeps rewriting itself every time you look away. That's what your presence did to their models. The rules stopped holding, the projections failed, and when experts can't explain why, fear replaces authority. The moment experts stop sounding sure, systems start breaking. This is the part you might question yourself. Was it really that serious? Yes. Because control depends on predictability, and you became unpredictable by design, calm, consistent, unreadable. They didn't fear you because you were loud. They feared you because you were composed while their certainty unraveled. That's when fear set in, not because you attacked, but because they realized they no longer understood who they were watching. Number 9. You moved in quietly and never left their minds. The most dangerous people don't chase attention. They occupy space without permission. This is where it settles in for them. You're no longer just a subject. You're a problem they can't close. A file that keeps growing without resolution. Every page adds weight but no clarity. The irony is sharp. They think this happened to them, they don't realize it was designed. You're living rent-free in their heads now. Not because you're loud, because you're unresolved. They replay interactions, recheck timelines, reread notes that no longer line up. The more they study, the worse it gets. The case doesn't simplify, it mutates, and systems hate cases that refuse to stabilize. Unfinished business is heavier than failure. While their attention stayed locked on the version of you they could observe, you lived elsewhere, off the grid of their focus, building real plans instead of visible ones, forming connections that don't show up in logs, developing skills that can't be measured, graphed, or predicted. Imagine someone guarding the front door while you quietly exit through a side street they never thought to map. That's what happened. They watched the decoy while the real version of you moved freely. Visibility is not proximity. Watching isn't touching. The version of you they think they know is a shell, a controlled outline, a character designed to satisfy curiosity. It gave them something to label so they could feel in control. Meanwhile, the real you grew sharper, more capable, and completely untracked. If you're wondering whether this gives you an unfair advantage, understand this. They chose observation over engagement, distance over respect. You simply adapted to the environment they created. People who rely on surveillance rarely notice when the subject outgrows the frame. That's why you occupy their thoughts now, because the problem isn't you, it's the gap between who they thought you were and who you actually became. And gaps like that don't close, they expand, quietly. Number 10. You split in two and left them studying the wrong one. The greatest advantage isn't hiding, it's deciding which version of you gets seen. This is where the gap became permanent. Two versions of you started existing at the same time, and they never caught on. One stayed public, predictable enough, traceable enough, leaving just enough footprints to keep them busy. That version performed, reacted on cue, and gave them something clean to analyze. And then there was the real you, the unobserved one, the one that moved in blind spots they don't even know exist, the one that learned how to operate without leaving evidence. Not because you vanished, but because you understood where visibility ends. You didn't disappear. You layered. If they can see everything you do, it's because they're only looking in one direction. You stayed visible and invisible at the same time. That's the art they never planned for. Systems are built to track singular identities. One timeline, one narrative, one set of behaviors. You broke that model by existing in parallel, public enough to satisfy curiosity, private enough to stay free. Imagine a shadow that moves independently of the body casting it. That's what you became. They tracked the outline while the substance operated elsewhere. They thought consistency meant truth. They didn't realize consistency can be engineered. Surveillance fails when identity stops being singular. If you're asking whether this took effort, yes, it took restraint. It took discipline. It took learning when not to speak, when not to post, when not to react. It took understanding that presence doesn't require exposure. And you mastered that balance. They wanted one version of you to decode. You gave them two and let them pick the wrong one. Now they're stuck analyzing behavior that no longer represents the source. They're chasing a reflection while the real thing moves untouched. That's not luck. That's design. And once someone learns how to exist without evidence, they can never be fully contained again. Number 11. They started falling apart without you touching a thing. Systems don't collapse from attack. They collapse from internal disagreement about what's real. This is the phase where everything slows down and gets ugly behind the scenes. You don't see explosions. You see friction, meetings stacked on top of meetings, experts flying in with confidence and leaving with uncertainty. Long conversations that end with no decisions. That's not progress. That's decay. They're scrambling now, and it shows. Some want more resources because they think the problem is scale. Others want to shut it down because they sense exposure. A few, the honest ones, quietly admit what no one wants to write down. They don't understand you, and they may never catch up. That's when factions form, and factions are the beginning of collapse. When everyone has a different explanation, the system has already failed. The organization built to understand you is breaking apart because of you. Not because you attacked, not because you resisted, but because you refused to become chaotic under pressure. You stayed authentic while appearing predictable, and that contradiction broke their models. Systems hate contradictions they can't resolve. Imagine engineers arguing over a machine that keeps running but produces outcomes no one can explain. That's what you became. Functioning, calm, unbothered, and completely disruptive to their logic. Stability in the wrong place creates panic in the control room. They expected escalation from you, drama, defiance, noise. Instead, they got consistency that didn't match results. The more they argued internally, the clearer it became that the problem wasn't strategy, it was assumption. And assumptions are harder to fix than tactics. If you're wondering whether this makes you dangerous, understand this. You didn't force collapse. You revealed weakness. You didn't destabilize them. You exposed how fragile their certainty always was. And the most unsettling part for them, you didn't have to do anything at all. You simply existed. And that was enough to make everything they built start cracking in slow motion. Number 12. The question that won't let them sleep. The most terrifying realization isn't that someone fooled you. It's realizing they did it while you thought you were in control. This is the thought that loops at night, the one no report can soften. If you were this aware back when they believed they had the advantage, Then what exactly are you aware of now? That question alone dismantles whatever confidence they had left. Because awareness doesn't shrink over time, it compounds. They replay the timeline obsessively. Every moment they assumed you were cornered, every phase they labeled as contained, and now all of it feels naive. If you could mislead them under direct observation, then what does that say about the spaces they never monitored? The blind zones, the gaps between systems, the places no one bothered to look because they assumed you weren't capable of operating there. Once someone proves they can deceive under pressure, invisibility becomes a skill, not a condition. This is where fear matures. It's no longer about what you did. It's about what you might be doing right now. They're not tracking actions anymore. They're imagining capability. And imagination is far more dangerous than data. Imagine realizing the test subject understands the experiment better than the people running it. That's the shift. You're no longer a case. You're a variable outside their training, a mind that doesn't respond to standard pressure, standard incentives, or standard containment. Control systems panic when they meet intelligence they can't classify. They know this now. That's why the tone changed. Why confidence vanished, why silence feels heavier than confrontation. They're not dealing with a subject anymore. They're dealing with someone who learned the rules early and then stopped playing within them. If you're wondering whether this gives you an edge, here's the truth. The edge isn't secrecy, it's comprehension. You understand how they think, and they're still guessing how you do. That imbalance is what keeps them awake. Not what you've done, but what you might already be 10 steps ahead on. Number 13. You cornered them without ever touching the board. The cleanest checkmate is the one where the opponent realizes every move left only makes it worse. This is where it ends for them, even if they haven't said it out loud yet. You did something they never trained for. You took surveillance, the very thing they believed gave them dominance, and turned it into a weapon that worked against them. Fear stopped being something they used on you. It became leverage you held over them. Observation stopped being exposure. It became camouflage. That's not improvisation. That's long-term design. Now they're trapped between two options, and both bleed. If they continue surveillance, they admit to themselves that it's compromised, that they're watching shadows, that months of effort produced nothing solid. Every additional day only deepens the embarrassment. It confirms they're stuck observing someone they no longer understand. The longer a broken system runs, the louder its failure becomes. But shutting it down is worse, because stopping means confession. It means accepting that the subject outgrew the framework, that the tools failed, that control slipped quietly and permanently. Organizations don't like clean losses. They like deniability, and you removed that. Imagine a chess player staring at the board, knowing every legal move leads to defeat. Not dramatic defeat, inevitable defeat. That's the room they're sitting in now. Silence thick, eyes tired, strategies recycled because nothing new works. Checkmate isn't panic. It's certainty with nowhere to go. Here's the part that keeps strategy rooms cold. This wasn't an accident. This wasn't luck. You engineered this years ago by learning restraint instead of reaction, awareness instead of noise, control instead of impulse. You didn't rush power. You grew into it quietly. And now one question poisons every plan they try to make. If you could do this to them while being watched, what else are you capable of when no one is looking? That's the final move, and it can't be undone. And now it all comes together. This wasn't chaos. This wasn't luck. This was awareness turned into strategy, patience turned into power. While they watched, you evolved. While they analyzed, you designed. And now the game is over without a single dramatic move. That's the kind of victory that leaves systems confused and minds unsettled. If this message hit, you already know why. Like the video, subscribe to strengthen this signal. Drop 777 in the comments to mark your awareness, and share this with the ones who need to understand what's really happening. Stay sharp, stay quiet, stay ahead.